Undoubtedly, you all know the moving story Charles Dickens told in his novel Great Expectations about the experiences of Mr. Pip. Mr. Pip was a little boy living in a dreary village on the east coast of England. He had a prototypical very nasty stepmother and a father too weak to protect him from her. So Mr. Pip had a very bleak life, and it was likely to remain that way forever. But then a lawyer all the way from England entered the house and exclaimed, great expectations for Mr. Pip. It became clear that some anonymous benefactor had set aside a large amount of money for Mr. Pip, and that he could do with it as he wished. I feel today as Mr. Pip must have felt about the sudden turn in his fate. For most of my career it seemed to me that only the Americans can do original work in philosophy history, whereas we Europeans can only hope to follow them as well as we can. But with the Oulu Center for the Philosophical Studies of History that has been established by Joni Kuikkanen, a new era in the relationships between our American friends and the Europeans has announced itself. Now the Americans have good reasons to listen to us instead of the other way around. I foretell you that Oulu University will emulate Western University. Just look at the program for this conference. This is why I feel today like Mr. Pip, after he had been told about the wonderful future lying ahead of him. Well, now to business. In my talk today, I'll take up again the old issue of the relationship between history and the sciences. I approach it here from a new perspective, namely from that of Leibniz's philosophical system. My argument will be unreservedly apriorist and thus flout what became known since Kuhn, Quine and Rorty as naturalized epistemology, post-positivism or pragmatism. I therefore begin by saying why I don't hesitate to take up that challenge. Second, having thus cleared the way for my own a priorist approach, I briefly justify my choice for Leibniz. Thirdly, I'll argue that for Leibniz the representation and the represented are identical, and next that we must nevertheless hold on to these two terms because Leibniz's monadological metaphysics compels us to do so, and more generally, since this is how we must conceive of his notion of the sign. Fourthly, in the notion of the sign, we may find a common ground between mathematics and historical representation, so that's where the two meet. But from there, the sciences and historical representation move into opposite directions. Algorithms play no role in historical representation, and scientists don't project meanings on science as historians do. Fifthly, the sciences and historical representation meet each other again when it comes to argumentation. I'll explain this in terms of what has been called Leibniz's economy principle, having its root in the differential calculus he had discovered at roughly the same time as Newton. Two phases can be discerned in 20th century philosophy of science. An a priorist phase represented by logical positivism and Popper's falsificationism, and an anti-a priorist phase that can be associated with Kuhn's historicism, Quine's naturalized epistemology, and contemporary pragmatism. Regardless of one's final opinion about the protagonist of the a priorist approach, one can only be impressed by the boldness of their account of science and of scientific rationality. Anti-a priorist philosophy of science cannot boast of such spectacular results. Think of Kuhn's historicization of scientific rationality, or of the latent skepticism of Quine's account of science. For how else to regard his, Quine's, thesis of the indeterminacy of theory and or the Quine-Dehaene thesis, of the inscrutability of reference and the indeterminacy of translation. Whatever one's opinion on the logical positivist and falsificationist account of science, their adherents attempted to do justice to the great miracle in modern history, the great miracle, namely the amazing success story of modern science in the last 3 centuries. Whereas Kuhn and Quine's skepticist account of science had a peculiar effect of transforming this miracle into an unfathomable mystery. If we are amazed already by that success story, we must be even far more so after having read Kuhn or Quine. I shall be the last to question the achievements of anti-apriorist philosophy of science, or of the history and sociology of knowledge. Undoubtedly, the anti-apriorist philosopher will now insist that it is unwise to hope for more than he can give us. Well, perhaps, but if so, this is surely deeply disappointing. Quine's main argument against a priorist philosophy was that it presupposes the analytic versus synthetic distinction, and that this distinction must be abandoned. There is no need to recite here Quine's sophisticated argument against the traditional view of analytical truth. A simple example may suffice. Take the statement, if X is the son of Y, X cannot be the daughter of I. The a priorist would claim this to be an analytical truth, since the meaning of the word son and daughter logically exclude the possibility that X could be both I's son and Y's daughter. But now that transgender operations have become possible, this allegedly analytical and eternal truth has been falsified empirically. Hence, whereas apriorism is the belief that some statements are analytically and irrefutably true by virtue of the meaning of the words used for stating them, Quine does not hesitate to say no statement is immune to revision. Revision, even of the logical law of the excluded middle, has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics. In this way, Quine pulls the rug out under the a priorist philosopher's feet. Since Quine's argument is nowadays accepted by many as a kind of kterma eisai in philosophy, it's worthwhile to recall that it has been criticized by many philosophers and logicians since Strawson and Grice in the 1950s down to the present. But instead of elaborating on this, I will state now my own position about apriorism. It is basically that I don't see in Quine's argument against the analytic-synthetic distinction an obstacle to an a priorist approach to the issue of the writing of history, as will be presented below. This must come as a bit of surprise, so let me explain myself. Quine questions apriorism as a claimant to truth, not as a style of argument. His point is that it cannot found scientific knowledge and truth, but this does not condemn apriorism as a manner of analyzing knowledge and how it is expressed. That latter question did not much interest Quine and his followers, since they knew the answer to it already and agreed that knowledge is typically expressed in terms of scientific theories, whether simple ones, such as the gas law of Boyle-Gay-Lussac, or complex ones, such as quantum mechanics. Easy. Now, the big problem with historical writing is that you have no easy answers there. There are no theories in historical writing as there are in the sciences. Worse still, it is not the least obvious what should count as their equivalent in historical writing. Quine himself agrees. In softer sciences, from psychology and economics to sociology to history, I use science broadly, checkpoints are sparser and sparser to the point that their absence becomes the rule rather than the exception. Observation categoricals are implicit still in predicting of archaeological finds and the deciphering of inscriptions. But the glories of history would be lost if we stopped and stayed at the checkpoints. A remarkably frank and candid statement, opening up again the old abyss between the sciences and the humanities. This throws the philosophy of history back to a very elementary stage. If historical knowledge is not expressed in terms of theories, what else does? As far as I'm familiar with contemporary philosophy of history, answers to that question are a matter of assumption rather than the conclusion of well-considered argument. Indeed, there's no lack of such answers. To begin with, das Rankes well-known zeigen, wie es eigentlich gewesen. Next, the suggestion that historians offer causal explanations of the past. Suggestion has a number of variants. Thinks of Mackey's Innes conditions, of counterfactual analysis, or of explaining the past in terms of Bayesian probability, as was so brilliantly proposed by Avi Tucker, who is here today with us. Thirdly, since Schleiermacher, there has been an immense variety of hermeneutic interpretations of historical representation. Fourthly, one can think of the narrativists, claiming that the historical text as a whole is the vehicle of historical knowledge. Now, the state of affairs in contemporary philosophy of history is that causalists talk to causalists, hermeneuticists to hermeneuticists, and narrativists to narrativists. The preliminary question of who is right about historical knowledge and how it is expressed is thus abandoned for the subsidiary question of who stands strongest within each individual paradigm. The protagonist of each paradigm projects its own paradigm on empirical reality of historical writing. They see in it only what they had already decided to see in it. That reality functions therefore like a mirror, making these protagonists always reflect themselves when looking in it. This gets me to the crux of my argument: how to avoid this circularity. My answer is basically that a return to a priori argument then is inevitable. Let me explain. What we then need, above all, is an exposition as detailed and elaborate as possible of how one of the paradigms, or its sub-paradigms, conceives of historical knowledge and of the essentially semantic questions of where we must locate the vehicle of historical knowledge. Now, drawing upon such an exposition is basically an a priori deduction of what follows from some preferred axiomatic option. The next stage is to compare these a prioristically generated accounts of what historical knowledge is with empirical reality of historical writing, and to try to discover which of them gives the best fit. Admittedly, there is no guarantee that in this way the handicap of the mirror image will be overcome, for a truly unbiased comparison of the different paradigms is unlikely. But again, without a priorist argument, one will get nowhere. Next, a priorist argument is used here only to establish what logically follows from the adoption of any one paradigm in philosophy of history, and hence definitely not as an attempt to offer a foundation of historical knowledge and truth. Its role is merely auxiliary here. In this way, my argument here sidesteps Quine's anti-foundationalism. At stake is not a priorist argument as such, but the question which paradigm best fits the actual practice of historical writing after the most central insight of each of the paradigms has been elaborated down to its very last consequences by means of a priorist argument. Up till now, I believe, philosophers of history have not yet even begun to address this issue. Hence, extrapolating Quine's criticism of the analytic synthetic distinction, with which I have no quarrel, into a total ban on all a priorist argument will leave one clueless when addressing the most elementary issues in philosophy of history. In sum, we will need an Archimedean point of view in philosophy of history, so that one can draw up from that point, again by means of a priorist argument, a conception of historical knowledge and of the semantics of the writing of history. As some of you may know, I choose this Archimedean point in the notion of historical representation. But clearly this is too vague and too little for what is meant with the term historical representation. That term will have to be exchanged for something leaving no room for misunderstandings. Think of geometricians wishing to discuss the circle. Then the mere word circle will not suffice, nor definitions such as the circle is a curved line, or a line dividing all points in a flat plane in such a way that no point enclosed by that line is also outside it. Only a definition such as all the points of a flat plane being at the same distance from a certain point P will do the trick and define the circle. On the basis of this definition of the circle, the geometrician can go on and discover properties of the circle by means of a priorist argument that were not mentioned in the definition. So that's what we would need for historical representation. Taking this into account, I propose the following definition. A historical representation is the ordered set of all true statements to be found in historical texts as could have been written in the West since the beginning of the 19th century. I add two comments. First, since the days of Plato and Aristotle, many theories have been developed on what a true statement is. I don't believe the theories have any direct bearing on the problem of historical representation, so let anyone adhere to whatever consistent theory he or she prefers. Next, there is the logical distinction between a set of statements and individual statements, since the latter has the subject-predicate form, whereas the former has not. This distinction therefore requires us to distinguish between historical research, what is expressed in terms of individual statements, and historical representation, what is expressed in terms of sets of statements. Historical representations concern the sets and not their individual members. So the theorist of historical representation may assume these members to be true without having to bother about what makes them true or false. Then Leibniz. Self-evidently, the next question is whether this definition of historical representation invites us to adopt a specific variant of a priorist argument, and if so, which? This question is not difficult to answer. Leibniz's name immediately comes to mind. Firstly, Leibniz scholars such as Dielman, Köhler and Meinke already pointed out around 1900 that for no prominent philosopher in the history of Western thought, the notion of representation had been so crucially important as for Leibniz. Next, as I argued elsewhere, Leibniz's so-called praedicatum in est subjecto principle is ideally suited for establishing what is entailed by the definition of historical representation presented here. As the principle's name suggests, so the subjecto in est praedicato in est subjectum principle, as the principle's name suggests, the idea is that all of a subject's properties can be analytically be derived from the notion of the subject. The claim is the logical counterpart of Leibniz's metaphysics, stating that the world consists of what I elsewhere refer to as strong individuals. However, if historical representation is defined as I did a moment ago, the choice for the strong individual is inevitable. For according to that definition, the statement of a historical text does two things. First, what is expressed by them is ex hypothesi assumed to be true of the past they are about. This firmly ties a representation to a specific part of the past and prevents it from starting to float freely through the centuries. Second, the nature of a representation is self-referentially or recursively determined by the statement it contains. As a result, the relationship between the representation and the statements repeats Leibniz's predicatum in as subjecto principle, and in both cases all of a thing's properties can logically be derived from the very notion of that thing. Since Leibniz's account of the individual, called by him a substance or a monad, deviated so widely from modern conceptions of it, while getting to the heart of historical representation, Leibniz's logic and metaphysics is the most suitable instrument available for further elaboration of a representationist account of historical writing. The two present dominant theories of representation are the resemblance and the substitution theory of representation. According to the former, a representation resembles what it represents. Think of a drawing of a tree and the tree itself. Now think of a red spot on a map of France representing Paris. This spot does not resemble Paris. Nevertheless, in the practice of mapping and map reading, the red spot is made to function as a cartographic substitute of the actual city of Paris. This is why theorists such as Gombrich, Goodman and Dento prefer the substitution theory to the resemblance theory of representation. It may be that there is more truth in the resemblance theory than the adherents of the substitution theory are willing to allow, so that one had best look for some prudent mix of the two. Anyway, both theories agree, and that's what is important. Anyway, both theories agree that the representation and what it represents are different things. However, in Leibniz's theory of representation, the representation and its represented are identical. Obviously, in at first sight, counterintuitive theory of representation, for why still speak of a represented and its representation if both are identical? In order to see what Leibniz had in mind, we best focus on his metaphysics. Leibniz's metaphysics is based on two seemingly conflicting assumptions. The first one is that the monads are windowless. They can only perceive what is within themselves. This is the source of his radical individualism. The second one is what a monad perceives is the totality of all other monads, constituting together all of the universe, if seen from the perspective of that monad. The obvious tension between these assumptions is taken away by Leibniz by the further assumption that God saw it that what each windowless monad perceives in its inner self is in complete agreement with all what the others perceive in their inner selves. This is Leibniz's principle of pre-established harmony. Thanks to it, there is a reality of which all monads have the same perceptions. Leibniz calls this reality the phenomena bene fundata. It is merely a phenomenological reality, not to be confused with the actual metaphysical reality of the totality of all the monads. Nevertheless, it is bene fundata, well-founded, thanks to God's effort to ensure that all phenomena agree with each other. This then is what common sense demands us to see as the world in which we live, the world of the phenomena bene fundata. Lastly, Leibniz's system is in a sense an attempt to derive from his monadological metaphysics the nature of both the monads and of the world of the phenomena bene fundata with just a few logical principles, such as the predicatum in subjecto principle we encountered already, The contradiction principle of the principle of sufficient reason, of the indivisibility of monads, of the identity of indissolubles, and that of proportionality. With an appeal to these principles, Leibniz deductively clarifies the metaphysical nature of both the monads and the roots the phenomena bene fundata have in them. In all of the history of philosophy, never ever a system was constructed in which metaphysics was so logical and logic so metaphysical. Leibniz attempted to solve the tension between the two assumptions mentioned just now with an appeal to God's intervention that will convince a few people. Indeed, I wouldn't hesitate to see here the main weakness of the system. But, and that's, one of the nice things for me, the problem mercifully disappears if the system is applied to historical writing. The decisive datum here is that ex hypothesi, historical representations, consist of true statements. That was what I began by explaining in the beginning of my text. Let's assume the validity of the following two principles. True statements are never incompatible with each other, and two, all statements about the world are either true or untrue. Tertium non datur, partial dialectics and valued logic. It follows that what Leibniz needed pre-established harmony for is unproblematically thrown into our lap as soon as we translate his system to historical writing and see his monads as historical representation. It is then as if past reality has been so kind and obliging to do for the historian all the computations that Leibniz had assigned to God. But there is one more problem with the system. Leibniz requires us to conceive of the monological universe as an infinity of monads mirroring themselves in each other, without there being anything outside or beyond this metaphysical fact, basic metaphysical fact. This almost inevitably invites the complaint that this cannot be, since it would reduce the Leibnizian universe to the nonsensical status of a house of mirrors, where everything mirrors everything else, but with the all-important qualification that there is nothing to begin or to trigger this endless mirroring process. So if we are prepared to go along with Leibniz metaphysics, it may seem that we must postulate, in addition to his metaphysics, something existing outside and independently of this endless mirroring process, and that is actually mirrored by the mirrors. Just as in a house of mirrors, nothing will happen as long as nobody had entered it. A metaphysically upgraded version of the phenomena bene fundata being the obvious candidate here, and then proper representational order seems to have been restored. For them, the domain of the phenomena bene fundata and the represented, and that of the monads, that of their representations. However, as we must immediately recognize, this is at odds with Leibniz's claim that there is no reality outside the monads and how they represent the world, and two, that the phenomena bene fundata must therefore be located in that world and not outside it. For Leibniz, there is nothing outside or beyond representation and their representatives. Forgetting about this is missing the whole point about Leibniz's metaphysics. This identity of being and of being perceived is the metaphysical justification of Leibniz's identification of the representation and the represented. As Leibniz sees it, the representation is the represented as represented by the representation. And two, the represented is the representation that is represented by or in terms of that represented. Admittedly, a difficult and mind-boggling thesis. The following comparison may therefore be helpful. Think of a landscape and a painting of that landscape. It then seems natural to say that the painting is the representation and the landscape the represented. But is it? For think of two painters painting the same landscape, and when doing so producing two different paintings of that same landscape. Then there must also be two different representatives, for each of the two painters projects his own representative on that landscape. But our common thinking about what goes on here fails to do justice to these states of affairs. We will unproblematically say that the landscape itself is the represented and not what the painters projected on it. But this could not possibly be correct, for representatives always correspond to representations. And if representations differ, their representatives must do so as well. So our commonsensical belief that the represented and the represented thing are identical is mistaken. This then is why Leibniz is, as always, more precise and radical than we ordinarily are ourselves. He differentiates between the landscape and what the painters project on it, and subsumes the former in the metaphysics of the phenomena bene fundata. And so it is with historical representation. Most revealing here is the following observation of Alfred Dento. And something of the same thought is true for the historical period considered as an entity. It is a period solely from the perspective of the historian, who sees it from without. For those who lived in the period, it would be just the way life was lived. And asked afterwards what it was like to have lived then, they may answer it from the outside, from the historian's perspective. From the inside, there is no answer to be given. It was simply the way things were. So when the members of a period can give an answer in terms satisfactory to the historian, the period will have exposed its outward surface and in a sense be over as a period. The idea is that a certain time is historical. Just a moment. The idea is that a certain time, a certain historical period is so only from the outside. If seen or experienced from the inside, it is not. Then it simply is how things are. So something is a historical period only from a perspective or point of view later than it. From a point of view transforming the present reality into historical reality. And at first sight, trivial insight, but it has unexpected implications for how we must conceive of historical reality. In order to see this, we must start with the recognition that events as such are neither past, present, or future. It's only the speaker's temporal position with regard to them that makes them so. Hence, events are part of past reality only when we have discovered, decided, or concluded that we now live in a basically later time. But from that moment, past reality exists no longer. It has then died back like a tree's branch from which life withdrew. As long as the past still existed, it was not yet historical, but actual reality. Whereas common sense demands us to situate historical reality in the past itself, which is the historical ontology almost universally accepted in philosophy history. But with Dento, we must recognize this is not how it is. To put it with a dash of paradox, historical reality only comes into being when the past no longer exists. Historical reality as a represented exists in the form of its representations only. Hence their identity and why we must avoid looking for something behind or beyond historical representations. This is where Dento's argument is in agreement with Leibniz's metaphysics. I expect that the idea of this identity of the representation and the represented will still sound a bit mysterious to you. Fortunately, Leibniz translated his metaphysics into a theory of semantics that may perhaps dispel some of your doubts. In an absolutely crucial essay in his writings, Leibniz comes to discuss a kiliogon, hence a polygon with 1,000 equal sides. His argument is that we then have the word kiliogon, what he refers to as its notion, but not its idea. He intends to express with this qualification that we have no imagination of a kiliogon, such as you may have of 1,000 equal and sides, or for that matter of a triangle, pentagon, or an octagon. You can have an idea of those. Next, the geometrician may make use of these ideas in order to discover the properties of the kiliogon as a thing, as an intentional object, to use Zalta's terminology. And this then is how these three notions, these three concepts, notion, idea, and things are related in Leibniz semantics. Nevertheless, even though we have no idea or grasp the meaning of the word kiliogon, we can still go on to use that word when appealing to the ideas, 1,000 equal and side, and similar terms mentioned in already accepted geometrical thesis, in order to deepen our knowledge of the thing kiliogon. Now, and then follows a quotation, but I have already said what's in it. That's the basics of it. So I'll leave the quotes apart. If we use words like kiliogon for blindly or symbolical geometrical argument, no, I'm wrong. It ends by saying Leibniz that he writes that we go on using these terms kiliogon without knowing the meaning of this term kiliogon, and then they may function in a kind of blind of some symbolic reasoning. That's what this calculatio caeca means. If we use words like kiliogon for blindly or symbolical geometrical argument, calculatio caeca, they do not stand for something else, as for example for the meaning, but for themselves. They have then become empty signs. Ordinarily, symbols stand for or represent something else than themselves. But the sign is the kind of symbol that stands for itself. As for example, letters like A, B, C, and so on stand for themselves. They don't stand for certain sounds, as someone might object. When discussing the resemblance and the substitution theory of representation, we found that symbols ordinarily stand for something else than themselves. And hence, we should see signs as symbols whose content evaporated ever and ever more until it was finally reduced to zero. But that does not mean that at that stage these two notions, representation and represented, should have become redundant. It is true that their extension now is the same, but not their intension. Well, à la Frege and the morning star and the evening star. Moreover, we need the difference in intention in order to define the sign, namely as the symbol that stands for itself. If we had to abandon the notions of representation and the represented, it would be impossible to define the sign as the symbol identifying the representation and as represented. Furthermore, the necessity to hold on these two terms includes the notion of the sign in a more comprehensive account of representation. This gives us the link between the metaphysics of representation, Leibniz discussed before, and Leibniz semantics of the sign that I presented here. But having signs is not only sufficient. In mathematics and the sciences, signs are always part of a sign system, of an alphabet, as it is called nowadays. That sign system can be as simple as the numbers 0, 1 to 9, or comprise the letters of the alphabet, as is the case in letter algebra that was introduced by Vieta in the 15th century. Moreover, the alphabet should be such that it allows for a quasi-mechanical blind reasoning with the help of some appropriate algorithm. For example, one can divide and multiply numbers if written down in a decimal system, but not in that of Roman numbers. The theory of the sign and algorithms doing away with meaning and relying exclusively on machine-like, quasi-mindless operation was one of Leibniz's greatest discoveries, and it earned him the honor of often being called the father of mathematical and symbolic logic. Sibylle Kremer summarized it as follows: operative writings fulfill a double task. They serve as a medium and at the same time as an instrument for mental operations. Put metaphorically, with them languages are employed as a technique, so the algorithmic technique. It is this double function to represent and at the same time to calculate with what is being represented, in which the intellectual power of calculation has its roots. What makes them into symbolic machinery, into a mechanical amplifier of the intellect, is that the rules of the symbolic operation are not guided by what the symbols mean. Meaning has no role to play in mathematics. When referring to science as operative writing, Kremer wishes to emphasize that a sign always is something we can write down, something having a distinct physical form on paper that cannot be exchanged or confused with other such signs. Leibniz's blind calculation always requires something with which we can calculate. In the absence of science, the algorithms of arithmetic and of all varieties of mathematics, we would have just nothing to go on when wishing to perform a certain calculation. Calculation would then be impossible. But as soon as we have science and an appropriate algorithm, we can calculate with the science regardless of what the signs mean, where meaning is understood to be something necessarily different from what is the meaning of. Or to put it more poignantly, and in any case more correctly, in that case the signs are meaningless. Indeed, their meaninglessness is not a handicap, but a very guarantee of the correct results of blind calculation. Now, my claim is that Leibniz's arguments recounted just now enable us to establish where the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, namely historical representation, what they have in common, and from where they move into opposite directions. If we conceive the sign as a written symbol standing for or representing itself, there's no difference between mathematics and historical representation. In order to see this, I propose to discern between two functions of text expressing historical representations. That is, between the text as such and next the text as the vehicle of historical knowledge. We have to do with the former, so the text as text, when saying, for example, that it has a certain title, consists of 10 chapters, that sentence number X in the text states S, and so on. As such, the text is a symbol, albeit a hugely complex one, moreover a symbol standing for itself, and hence a sign. The second function of the sign manifests itself when we say things such as that for certain reasons this text does or does not contribute to our knowledge of historical reality. The content of these reasons is at stake in actual historical practice. Their formal aspects are discussed in causalist, hermeneuticist, and narrativist or pragmatist philosophy, whereas what I'm telling you today logically precedes the analysis of these formal aspects. Neither in mathematics nor in historical representations, are any change allowed in the form of the sign any change allowed once the form of the sign has been fixed by means of a self-referentially defined description. The objection that in history, as opposed to arithmetic and mathematics, omitting from or adding some sentences to a historical text will make little or no difference, since this leaves the text meaning unaffected, fails straight away, since historical texts as signs have no meanings. Signs have properties but no meanings. This also compels us to be more precise about the phrase, the meaning of the text, that we so often use. Since the text as text is a sign and hence cannot be said to have a meaning, that phrase can only stand for the meaning we project on or associate with the historical text as sign. As we may tie a horse, a dog, a cart or whatever to a hook in a wall. I deliberately say meanings in the plural in order to highlight one more misleading aspect of the phrase, the meaning of the text. Apart from mistakenly suggesting the text to have a meaning, we should also reject the belief that there could be just one meaning only for each text. As I argued elsewhere, a text meaning is intercontextual and always co-determined by the meanings attributed to other historical texts in the way suggested by Saussure. These meanings are vague and ill-defined clouds of associations floating in the semantic sky. There are no dictionaries to define or fix them. Meanings as such are not communicable. They only become so thanks to the written signs to which they are attached. Paradoxically, meaningful discussion in history is possible only thanks to meaningless signs. The sign is therefore the common ground of historical writing, mathematics and the sciences historical writing. But from there, both move into different directions. Whereas in mathematics and the sciences, science go together with algorithms, historical writing attaches meanings to meaningless signs. Nevertheless, even then a certain parallelism remains. Mathematics knows sciences as the number p, the natural logarithm e, the infinite, imaginary and complex numbers, and so on. Their intervention was conditional for the development of mathematics. Though the differences outweigh the similarities by far, the same could yet be said about the historian science. For the ongoing proposal of ever new science is decisive too for the growth of historical knowledge. But the difference between the algorithm on the one hand and meaning on the other is the exact measure of the unbridgeable gap between history and the sciences. Let's now turn to the question whether Leibniz philosophy may shed some new insight on the issue of historical rationality. Three answers to the question can be given, as it seems to me all of them having in common to be non-epistemological. For reasons of time, I restrict myself to the third one. Leibniz had a fascination for maxima and minima, making him unique amongst the august group of the 5 to 10 greatest philosophers in the history of Western thought, to which he undoubtedly belongs. This fascination announces itself already in his well-known claim that God decided to create the best possible world. See it this way: God disposed of a certain means to create the universe, but an unrestrained appeal to one of those means would be detrimental of what could be achieved by one or more of the other means, and vice versa. Put differently, the use of these means did not always and necessarily mutually reinforce that of others. On the contrary, an ill-considered use of one of them might undo what had been achieved with the help of others. Perfection goes thus overboard with Leibniz and is exchanged for a merely optimal use of the means one has at one's disposal. This is what has been called Leibniz's economy principle. Leibniz had this fascination for maxima and minima for both the metaphysical reason, the principle of continuity, and a mathematical one, his calculus. I leave aside the question how these two hang together and focus on the latter. Now, you will all recall from secondary school that differential calculus allows you to calculate the local maxima and minima of a function by establishing where the derivative of that function has the value 0. And we may move away from maxima and minima where the value of the derivative function approaches the infinite, either plus or minus. The next crucial step in Leibniz's argument is his move from monad or substance to function, a development recorded already in Ernst Cassirer's book Substanzbegriff und Funktionsbegriff of 1910. The move need not surprise, since the monad is the successive series of representations it has of the universe from the day of its creation down to its end. So there always is a relation between each individual phase of its life and the representation it will then have of the universe. In this way, the latter is a function of the former. Leibniz speaks here of the lex series. That is to say, the law of the succession of the states in which the monad finds himself. Leibniz's move from substance to function is the most important one, since it clears the road for an overcoming of the limitations of Aristotelian logic by making room for a logic of relations needed for an account of modern science. Leibniz himself, unfortunately, was not aware of this himself. Let's now return to the question of what the foregoing implies for historical representation. Before getting to this, one obstacle has to be removed. It could be objected that the move from Leibniz to historical representation could never be made, since Leibniz's system is a metaphysical and logical account of God's creation as it is given to us, while the historian faces the difficult task of what form he should give to his monad, that is, to his representations of historical reality. The objection is correct, but in fact this is merely a matter of having to bite the bullet. The position of the historian is not unlike that of God in Leibniz's system. Indeed, the historian creates historical reality, though not the past, I insist on that, by means of the representations he offers of it. I recall to mind here my previous observation that historical reality comes into being in the form of representations. Two answers can be given to the question what Leibniz's calculus and his notion of the differential quotients may tell us about historical rationality. One answer concerns historical writing and the other historical reality. With regard to the former, so historical writing, there are two quotes. The one, on the next page, we better skip these, and I have a summary of them after the second quote. And there I continue. When isolating those elements from these quotes that are applicable to historical writing and representation, Leibniz's criteria for historical rationality can be summed up as follows. The best representation is the one which succeeds in combining a maximum of variety with a maximum of order, a maximum of effect with a minimum of means, a maximum of unity with a maximum of diversity, or the greatest number of subjects in the smallest possible volume. It comes close to what I once called myself the scope criterion for historical rationality. When trying to satisfy the the historian will always have to steer, When trying to satisfy it, the historian will always have to steer a careful middle of the road between two or more mutually opposing principles. The historian may drown his readers in a mass of historical facts, and he can also restrict himself to the formulation of some historical claim or major thesis. Well, and then it's of course necessary that he finds the right juste milieu between these two. Then next, with regard to historical reality itself, so just a moment ago I spoke about historical writing, but then historical reality itself. In continuation with this, Leibniz has also a suggestion for what the historian should focus on in his representation of historical reality. When discussing meaning above, we found that the contours of historical meaning and hence of historical reality are the product of the interaction of historical representations. Hence, no historian addressing a certain historical topic can afford to disregard where these maxima and minima are located in these previous representations. This will be for him where in historical reality things rarely happen, and what therefore must be the focus of his attention, at least for the time being. For the historian will in all likelihood hope to show that things rarely happened at a place slightly different from what was until now common wisdom. If not, why write a book? But the focus is again on what has happened and why do things take place. And this is what you see in the last quote from the Theodicee. And then have a look at the passage that I have italicized. And just as in mathematics nothing would happen, il ne se fait rien du tout, nothing discernible, everything remaining the same, or if possible even nothing taking place at all, if there is neither maximum nor minimum. So maxima and minima are here even said by Leibniz to be the condition of all existence. I add 3 comments. In the first place, it's certainly not my intention to present here differential calculus as the basis of historical representation. That would, of course, be patent nonsense. Only that differential calculus can be seen as as mathematics counterpart in the writing of history. Next, I do not claim anything particularly deep or revealing with these criteria for historical reality. On the contrary, anyone only superficially familiar with the writing of history will immediately recognize what I have in mind with these criteria. Even more so, the less obvious and self-evident these would be, the more reason there is to doubt my account of them. The fact that this account will in all likelihood immediately appeal both practicing historians and philosophers of history, if the latter are prepared to put aside unhelpful philosophical prejudice, does not in the least diminish the importance of the criteria of historical rationale expounded here. On the contrary, just think of what would be left of historical writing and representation without them. Both historical reality and historical writing would immediately disintegrate into an incoherent and incomprehensible chaos. Thirdly, in this essay I derive by a priorist argument from an a priorist definition of historical writing an account as complete and detailed as possible of historical debate and of the criteria of historical reality. Though these criteria are not very surprising, abandoning would mean abandoning historical rationality and history as a discipline. So much then for the pragmatist a priori dogma of anti-apriorism. Well, then ultimately 2 last remarks. First, some people might wish to accuse Leibniz and me of supporting a variant of metaphysical idealism or phenomenalism. If so, I can see their point. Nevertheless, if mathematics, the sciences, and historical writing my apologies all have an elective affinity. All have an elective affinity with Leibniz metaphysical idealism. I think we had better stop being priggish and be more open to it than we have hitherto been. Next, I expect some of you will now want to say to me, well, Mr. Ankersmit, you've told us that in both mathematics and history, signs are symbols that stand for or represent themselves. That historical signs do not have or represent a meaning in the way words or sentences do, but that meanings are projected on signs and a whole lot of other things. But you still have not yet explained to us how, in your view, historians represent the past. I have two answers to that complaint. First, it presupposes that we have on the one hand the past and on the other representations of it. Now, as you may remember, this is precisely the model that Leibniz urges us to drop in his metaphysics. There is no reality behind or beyond the monads, and similarly, no historical reality independent of historical representations. Second, what I have said in my talk is, in my view, how we should conceive of historical representation. If you ask for more, you are like this imaginary visitor of Cambridge University, mentioned by Ryle in his concept of mind, who had been shown all the university's building, etc., and then indignantly exclaimed, "But you haven't yet shown me Cambridge University." But in both cases there simply is nothing more to say, and that is why I shut up right now.
Great, we have some 20 minutes time to discuss, so please questions and comments. Yeah, you go.
Patrick Noel, I'm a historian from Canada, Winnipeg. I have a question that is probably meant to provoke you, even though I know you're sick.
But I can have something more. I'm still not that.
Maybe I'm too much of a pragmatist myself. I want to return to your first sentence of the paper. Between history and sciences. What if I say to you history is a science, like physics is a science, like chemistry is a science, like literary studies is a science? I mean, what is a science for you? Aren't you adopting an outdated conception of science? Like historians, just like physicians, they write papers, they submit it to peer review. We have journals.
Yeah.
I want to know more about your history and science. Maybe history is a science like many others.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and answering it is a bit complex. I think one would best start with, we could even say two traditions in answering it. You have on the one hand the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and on the other hand the German tradition. So the Germans, like you, have no problem at all in speaking about the Geisteswissenschaften, and they come up with all these kind of arguments that you have been proposing, namely that it's a rational research, that it has progress, that's based on a critical analysis and weighing of the documents, and that from that perspective there is no unsurmountable barrier between what's being done in the Geisteswissenschaften and, on the other hand, the Naturwissenschaften. It's different in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and then it's even reflected in the language used by Anglo-Saxon philosophers. They will speak of the sciences, and when an American philosopher speaks of the science, of an Anglo-Saxon philosopher speaks of the sciences, he has in mind the natural sciences, and the humanities would be something different. So, on the one hand, it is a cultural difference, but nevertheless, the important issue naturally is, of course, is there something underlying these traditional differences? And that has provoked a great deal of debate. You know, perhaps, the arguments by people like Windelband, and then he said, well, the sciences are nomopathic. They are interested in what's general in the phenomenon that we observe, whereas historians are always interested in what's idiographic, so what makes them into something individual. Then you have the hermeneuticists, and according to the hermeneuticists, historians understand the past by empathy, by trying to reliving what went through what went through the mind of a historical agent. Now, obviously, this doesn't work at all in the sciences. When a chemist, for example, would come up with the explanation, well, if you have here a hydrogen atom and there are two oxygen atoms, why do they become water? And then would say, well, I project myself on the sea, and I would say that would be great fun to join up to the three of us to a water molecule. That wouldn't be taken to be science, of course. So if you, have a closer look at science, you see that there is a number of quite convincing ways of differentiating between the two. And this is actually also part of the background of my talk, that I want to make clear that it's not as easy as that, and that there is a certain amount of continuity between the sciences and history, and that was also part of my enterprise in this talk. That in order to find out about this, you need a semantic analysis of knowledge, and this is something that has neither been done, that has neither attracted a great deal of attention in philosophy of science, for the very obvious fact that people in the sciences, so philosophy of science, already knew what is the form of science, namely scientific theory. Whereas in the case of history, you have these three positions that I mentioned. On the one hand, the hermeneuticists, the causalists, and then the narrativist. But they stopped there and never bored deeper and tried to say, well, we have this intuition, but now we must refine it, as I said, by means of a priori argument, and then we can compare these three models to actual historical practice, and then we have an idea what the semantics of historical knowledge is. And there is no, right at this moment, there is no agreement about the semantics of historical knowledge. And that is, I think, absolutely fatal, because as long as this is absent, you cannot really meaningfully discuss historical knowledge. You must know how it's expressed and how it must be defined, and in what aspects of how it's, in what aspects of a historical text you can expect to find it. And as long as you don't have this, you always will remain talking at cross purposes.
And of course, that empirical confrontation is already theory-laden. I mean, the historical practice, actual historical practice, is already, how do we pick what is historical practice as such? It's already theory-laden, as Zillenak has.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Yeah. But nevertheless, I think that by this a priorist approach, you can get closer to the problem. As I said already in my lecture, well, I surmise that it won't solve all of the problems because everyone sees well, what he wishes to see in it, but nevertheless, the questions that the adherents of each of the disciplines of the three disciplines put forward, they will put it forward with a greater precision, and that might contribute to the efficacy of the debate.
Thank you. Avi is the next.
Thank you. Thank you for your paper. It goes back into the beginning of your career, 1983. In the bottom of page 4, you are defining historical representation, last sentence in page 4. A historical representation is the ordered set of all true statements to be found in historical texts as been written in the West since the beginning of the 19th century. You're mixing here, you start with a kind of an a priori general definition, order set statements, historical texts, and then you move to historical subjunctive as could have been written in the West since the beginning of the 19th century. So probably, I don't think you mean that there's something special about the West or the beginning of the 19th century. What you want to say is something that is within what I call the Rankian paradigm. And the Rankian paradigm gives us every reason to think that historical knowledge is more reliable than knowledge that is offered by physics, for example, because physics justifies, the history of physics justifies what is known as the pessimistic induction, that is, whatever knowledge we have today will be proven false in the future. And that's what happened to physics, and there's every reason to think that it will continue to be. I mean, quantum physics is internally incoherent, so of course there will something new will happen. The Rankian paradigm has been the one and only paradigm we ever had in scientific historiography, and it has never been overturned. So probably what you mean is not some historical subjunctive specificity, but something about the Rankian paradigm that makes it special as a historical representation in comparison with other historical representations. So what I would ask you is to clarify what do you take to be special about the Rankian paradigm. And of course you know what I would answer. It would be something about the relationship to the evidence and historical truth and a lot of things that you haven't mentioned, but I would like to know your opinion.
Well, it's actually quite simple. You have historical writing since the dawn of mankind. And many people will dispute, for example, is mythology, is that still history? Well, you could say, yes, it's the story about how a tribe or a nation came into being. Is Homerus, is that history? In a way, yes, it's told about the fight of the Greek with the Trojans. There is much, of course, of medieval history in which the saints and God play a large role. And when you would begin with a definition that would leave room for all of them, my intuition was then you might go awfully wrong. So I thought some way of narrowing it down. I also written as it could have been written down in the 19th century, but I think there is a kind of professionalization has taken place in the 19th century in Europe, and that is recognized by everybody. Just read the histories of historical writing, and then the feeling is, well, a new phase announced itself after Ranke, well, Gibbon perhaps, so I thought it wise to keep to these and not run unnecessary risks about someone saying, well, but what you're saying here about historical representation, that doesn't agree at all with Augustine's De Civitate Dei, and then you would be right, and I would be in trouble. So that's it's making things that I don't get into trouble then.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes.
Just briefly, then.
Precisely that sentence caught my attention, and I spent much of the time of the lecture trying to fill it in a different way. So I'll tell you what I've written. I still feel that your definition is a little too narrow, so I thought of putting in the following. A historical representation is the ordered set of true statements to be found in texts written with the intention of articulating meaningful accounts of things that occurred or existed in the human-related past that would somehow be of interest, that are somehow of interest to the writer and to her audience or audiences in the present and the future. That would accommodate such pikers as Herodotus and Thucydides, but then, of course, I deliberately left out the methodological dimension. And to what extent would you accept that kind of definition in preference to what you wrote? I mean, as could have been written in the West sounds very strange.
Yeah, I know, but as I already answered to Avi, I think some way of restriction is absolutely necessary, otherwise you get overwhelmed by all kind of examples which you'd rather not to do. Moreover, I wish to keep this definition as simple as possible because of the a priori approach. Perhaps I could have left it out, but well, then you might have these problems. Well, it's just the definition of the circle. Well, the set of all the points in a plane that have the same distance to a certain point, and that's what was for me the model for how to start with some axiomatic definition of historical representation, and then see how far you can develop it from there. And then it might even be, well, that the kind of things that Avi and you have in mind could be added in it, but in a later phase. I think in the beginning, well, less is more. So if in the case, well, as it is with a priori argument, then you should be precise and avoid being led astray by, well, more or less irrelevant associations, so that it can be carefully tracked by anyone what you're saying and what you're doing and what your argument is. But then the feedback is always to actual historical practice, and then you can perhaps say, well, if you have this a priori derived notion of what historical writing is, we have good reasons to believe that certain older or non-Western forms of historical representation could also very well fit in your model. And if not, that's of course then in itself again an interesting question.
Thank you. We have many questions in line, so I'll try to squeeze as many as possible. Please pre-read.
Okay, so basically it's also a follow-up. If I take your definition of historical representation, does it count also, for example, pictures, schemes, or spatial models of historical city? Also, basically, when I see historical representation, I take it as historical representation. Let us imagine, example, when I'm walking in some historical city, let's say Prague, with my friend, and we see a spatial model of the city. There are some small buildings, it's a spatial model, we see it, and my friend says, oh look, it's a Prague in 15th century. And I say, oh, it could not be 15th century, because there is a cathedral of St. Wheat missing. And then we approach the model, and when we are approaching it, we notice that it's not actually a historical model. So it's, for example, model, picture, or scheme, historical representation, as well as text. And how do we define historical representation?
Well, to that question, I would be quite categorical. Historical representation is a written text. For, well, it has these two, it has the sign, and of course then this sign may be a vehicle for historical knowledge. But as well, when I explained it with Leibniz and with Sibylle Kremer, you must have something that's written down on the page as the kind of signs that are used by mathematicians. A mathematician can't do anything. If he can't write an integral or a differential quotient on his paper. And so it is in history. That's a new dimension, so to speak, to the philosophy of linguistic philosophy of history. And there's been a great deal of debate inaugurated by Hayden White that we should take the linguistic turn. I think that's all a bit nonsense to say it as I think presently. But nevertheless, that you always have to do with written texts. That's, I think, the interesting fact, and indeed the fact that ties historical writing to the sciences and to mathematics.
Next one, later. Tony.
Thank you for the talk. I'm taking up this parallel between history and monadology. I think the parallel to sum up...
Sorry, between history and?
Parallel between history and monadology.
Yeah.
And I think the parallel to sum up consists in the fact that the representations represent other representations themselves and nothing else, right? So in monadology, it works. In Leibnizian monadology, it works on one ontological precondition, namely that there is nothing else to represent. That is why this representing the representations themselves creates harmony. Now, that is intuitively, as you yourself admitted, difficult to swallow in case of history, or at least this is not how we used to think of the historical representation. It seems to represent something other than the writing.
Yeah.
And you, on page 8, you draw this landscape example, when you argue that perhaps two landscape paintings are also then different, well, they represent different landscapes. But do they? I think we can distinguish, and we often do distinguish between two different paintings of one and the same landscape, even if they differ in color, and two different landscapes. Where I would think this parallel works better than in history would be, let's say, poetry and history of poetry, or literature and history of literature. That really maybe we can draw the monadology parallel further. But in case of history, it's a bit more difficult to agree what you say in the end, that there is no historical reality independent of historical representation. To dismiss the difference between literature and history, for example.
Well, the basic problem is, I think, that there's a great deal of confusion about historical reality. Most people, most philosophers of history, identify historical reality with the past. And this is something that, making use of Leibniz, I avoid. I say historical reality only comes into being when the past no longer exists. As long as the past still exists, there is history. So only in this, this tension or this distance between a later period and the past comes history into being, historical reality into being, and then it comes into being under these two guises of the representation and the represented. And that's the same as in as with the landscape, since you have three layers, so to speak. You have on the one hand the landscape painting, then you have the landscape, and then there is something in between, and that's how the landscape painter painted the landscape, and that's his representation that he projected on the landscape. But that is not the landscape itself. So you could never say that the landscape itself is the representative of the painter's representation. And that has its metaphysical foundation in Leibniz metaphysics, and is furthermore, for the two run completely parallel, as always the case is, as I've said somewhere in my lecture, there is no philosophical system where logic is so metaphysical and metaphysics so logical. This has also its counterpart in Leibniz's analysis of the sign, and there reappears again this identity of the represented and the representative in the form of the sign as a symbol that represents itself.
Yes. In 2 sentences, I think in a painting of the landscape, both the landscape and the painter's view of the landscapes are represented.
Pardon?
I think in a landscape painting, both the real forms of surface, of Earth's surface, and the landscape, and the painter's view of that is represented.
Well,
not just the second one.
Yeah, okay, there we completely agree, but the fact gets, how shall I put it, a new complexion if you have 2 land papers, two painters painting the same landscape, and where these 2 paintings differ from each other. And this is something that you have to account for, or one way or other. And I see no other way for doing this than by saying that the represented by one painter is different from the represented by another.